Okay, so we're going to talk now a little bit about types of abuse. Um, we're going to talk about intimate partner abuse primarily in this section, but there's also a little bit of crossover. So in an abusive relationship, abuse may take several different forms. A relationship does not have to involve physical hands-on violence to be an abusive relationship. So physical abuse would be things like hitting, kicking, slapping, shoving, torture, attacking someone with weapons. Those are things that are obvious. That's abusive, right? But it can also be just shoving or just being a little too rough with responding to things. That can be a red flag. Verbal abuse is insult, humiliation, and ridicule. And this is far more common. And there's a tactic that abusers use to make the abused person feel as if they're imagining it or they're overreacting. So, and that's called gaslighting. So a lot of people will tolerate verbal abuse because they minimize it for themselves. The abuser is minimizing it, and so they don't realize how bad it's gotten. So insulting, humiliating, ridiculing someone is abusive. Emotional abuse includes threats, and that can be threats of violence. That can be performing violence on an inanimate object, because that's an implied threat that you could also do that to the other person. Emotional abuse can involve humiliation or intimidation. Financial abuse is controlling the other person via their finances. That can be just taking money. That can be, a really classic presentation of that is the person who makes their spouse hand over their paycheck, and the spouse has no access to that money. But it can also be things like sabotaging jobs or sabotaging school. It's very common for people experiencing relationship violence to lose jobs or to fail out of school because their partner is harassing them at work or at school or preventing them from attending. So I actually know of several firings that have occurred because the abusive partner created difficulties at work, created a scene, showed up intoxicated, kept that person from coming to work. So sabotaging work or school is common, and it's intentional. It's intended to keep the abused person dependent on the abuser. Sexual abuse involves rape or forced or coerced sexual interaction. It was fairly recently in history that in most states, there was no such thing in the law as spousal rape. A spouse forcing sexual acts on their partner was not considered rape. It was considered their right. And fortunately now that's not the case, but there still are a lot of people who really see it that way. They don't think that you can rape someone that you are in a relationship with. So forced or coerced sexual interaction is also abusive. It's also part of that abuse pattern. I want to look at the power and control wheel. This is often used to show to people who may be in an abusive relationship to see how the interconnectedness, all of these behaviors may seem like different behaviors, but they all connect to the hub, which is power and control. So intimidation would be making someone feel afraid. Sometimes this doesn't even require words. Smashing or destroying things, abusing pets or others, displaying weapons. This is all intended to make someone afraid. Emotional abuse is making someone feel bad about themselves, calling them names. Humiliation. Isolation is controlling who someone has access to, controlling their ability to access others outside that relationship. Minimizing, denying, and blaming. This is any time that an abused person begins to say, this is not okay. I don't want to be treated this way, the abuser will minimize that and deny it. That didn't happen. You're remembering it wrong. It's not as bad as you think. You're overreacting. All of that is, some of that is gaslighting behavior, but all that is about minimizing, denying, and blaming. Abusers often use children to try to manipulate the partner. Economic abuse is preventing someone from getting or keeping a job, making them ask for money, giving them an allowance, not allowing them to have access to money, hiding money from the partner. You got to be careful with that, but because sometimes an abused partner is actually hiding money, or someone who is in partnership with a person who is addicted or who is not competent to manage money may have to hide money for the security of themselves or the family. But hiding money can also become abusive. But keeping someone financially dependent is economic abuse. Male privilege is a piece of this, even though women also can abuse men. The dynamics are a little bit different. So sometimes male privilege is used as a way to justify male abuse of women, coercion and threat. So there are all of these actions lead back to the same hub. Okay. And these actions may not just be taking place in that relationship. Frequently, people will say, well, I can't imagine that person being abusive. But if you really look at their actions toward others, the same interactions are there, the same patterns are there. Abusers frequently interact with everyone who they see as having less power in one way, and with those they see as having more power in another way. There tends to be a cycle, or there's a common pattern that's called a cycle of abuse. It is not in every abusive relationship, but it is a pattern that's commonly seen. There's a tension building phase. The abuser needs power and control. They'll pick arguments and blame the victim for things outside their control. The victim or the abused person can usually feel what's coming, and they're trying to do things to prevent the storm that they know is coming. There's the acute abusive episode, and this is more often physical violence. It may be triggered by a specific event. Sometimes the abused person will do something to trigger that event, because then they get it over with and they can move on to the next phase. That's still a violent relationship, and that's still not a healthy, safe relationship. The perpetrator may lose control, but the thought process now is that abusers often have more control than they claim to have. And this is one way to test that hypothesis, is like a mental test for that hypothesis. If an abuser loses control against someone with less power, could they control themselves if they became that angry with someone who had more power? So think of it as a linebacker test. A typical abuser is not built like an NFL linebacker, because there aren't that many NFL linebackers out there. So NFL linebacker makes this person just as angry as their partner makes them, does the exact same thing. If that person truly loses control and cannot help themselves, they cannot control the fact that they physically attack their partner, they're also going to physically attack that linebacker that did the same thing. So if you can control yourself when someone who can hurt you has offended you, then you can control yourself when someone that you can hurt has offended you. And I think that helps us get a better picture of, it's not a loss of control, it is a choice. And it's actually about asserting control. The acute episodes of physical abuse are unpredictable and tend to increase in severity and frequently continue to increase until there's a fatal incident. After an acute episode, there's often a tranquil phase. The abuser is apologetic, they're kind, they're loving, they bring gifts, there's no tension. And the abused partner they live in that space, in that phase where the tension is gone and their abuser is nice to them again. They may feel like that's the real relationship. And so when that tension starts to build, they may try to trigger the battering episode. They may either try to prevent it or try to trigger that battering episode so they can get through it and get back to that part of the relationship that they consider the real relationship. This is not the pattern with every abusive relationship, but it is a very common one. So we're going to come back in the next section and we're going to talk about sexual assault.